Penguin Random House presents Conversations with Mani Ratnam by Baradwaj Rangan, read by Vikrant Kaul. Some months after I began working on this book, after the initially awkward and nervous meetings with Mani Ratnam had steadied into reasonably confident conversations, I ran into the director Gautam Vasudev Menon. We talked about this and that, the generalities that unite two professionals plying their trades at opposing ends of the cinematic spectrum, him the maker, me the masticator, and then, for some reason, I told him about the book and about meeting Mani Ratnam for the first time in his office at Madras Talkies, where he spoke to me and I spoke to the table in front of him. Instantly, and if only for that instant, Menon and I were bonded in a secret brotherhood. He laughed and said he wasn't surprised. He had done the same thing when a hero he had sought out for a project had dispatched him to Mani Ratnam's office to narrate the screenplay. I couldn't look at him, Menon said. I mean, how can you? He's the man who made Nayakan. Perhaps acknowledging the powerful seductions of the cinema, almost every city at some point has had a movie hall named Eros. The one in Madras was on LB Road, on a plot that today houses a shiny showroom for the kind of foreign car that people those days could drive only in their dreams. But even in the early 1980s, when pachydermal ambassadors lumbered down roads too tiny to contain them, Eros was crumbling. A faded Art Deco facade opened out to an absurd excuse for a snack counter with pre-sealed packs of popcorn and cloudy glass jars stocked with palm-sized packets of roasted gram speckled with an evil-looking spice. Inside, where air conditioning would have necessitated a drastic revision of the ticket price of 2-something rupees, the task of circulation was entrusted to fans, drooping from the ceiling on long stems and pressed reluctantly into service like a napping child roused and ordered to fetch a bunch of bananas from the stall down the street. I bring these things up not to wade in nostalgia for an India that bears little resemblance to the country today, whose cities boast the biggest of buildings with the finest of facilities. I bring this up because despite the stale snacks, despite the strangulating heat, despite handed-down prints that flickered as if possessed by the ghosts of 1,000 previous projectors, this long-dead theatre will never die in my memories. This is where in 1985 I saw my first Mani Ratnam movie. It was Idaya Kaul, the director's fourth film, and the one that he considers his worst. I saw it 3 times. I wish I could say that I recognized, before anyone else, a titanic talent submerged under the wreck of this melodrama about thwarted Eros, with a singer pining for a long-dead love who will never die in his memories, and spurning the young woman who falls for him. But the reasons for my repeat viewings were probably the presence of Ilaiyaraaja's marvelous music and the absence of 24-hour TV, which meant that instead of flipping through channels and landing on a movie we felt like watching, we went to the theatres next door and saw the movies that were showing, like Pagal Nilavu, which Mani Ratnam had made earlier. This time too, the earth didn't move. But the release of Mona Ragam the next year brought to Madras some mild tremors, which by the director's next movie, Nayakan, intensified into a full-blown quake that reshaped the landscape of Tamil cinema. Even today, 25 years after the release of Nayakan, some of us remember our experience of the film as if we'd unknowingly stepped into the competition ring at a village fair and ended up flattened by the local wrestler. We couldn't move, we couldn't speak, during the film and even afterwards, as we lurched back home in a late evening bus, too stunned to slip into the genial ritual of post-movie analysis, too numbed by the serendipitous shock of stumbling into a moment that would forever alter our expectations of Tamil cinema. We knew we could no longer resign ourselves to the perfunctory cinematography and tinsel-strewn sets and an incestuous ethos birthed from Tamil films over the years. We knew now that we could not only dream about international standards of filmic achievement, but also attain them. Today, a quarter of a century older, I realize that we may have overestimated Mani Ratnam and undervalued the impact of the pioneers before him on Tamil cinema. But such is the impetuousness of adolescence. The body blow dealt by the film drove out reasoning and rationality. What was left was pure physical sensation. At this point, I suppose I should define we. I refer to people like me, born in Madras in the 1970s and ripening into cinematic awareness in the decade that followed, in Mani Ratnam's decade. We are possibly the most qualified to write about Mani Ratnam. We might also be the least qualified. Others, born in earlier and later decades, did not feel his impact the way we did. But they, shorn of our hyperbolic adoration, are probably better equipped to pin down his place in the Tamil cinema continuum. We couldn't, because to us, he wasn't just a filmmaker. And he didn't just make films. Mona Ragam onwards, and with the grand exceptions of Nayakan and Thalapathy, which wove riffs around the adult experience, he was a zeitgeist-defining showman who propped up in front of us mirrors into our selves, our young, urban selves. No one, just no one had put on screen what we thought, what we felt, what we dreamed the way Mani Ratnam did. Mani Ratnam was certainly not the first filmmaker who animated his films with the lifeblood of the young. During the course of these conversations, he revealed that he grew up enthralled to the taboo-splintering dramas of K. Balachandar, so attuned to the rebellions of youth, and before KB, there were directors like Sridhar, who in the 1960s bequeathed a youthful exuberance to films like Kada Likka Nera Milai, 2.5-hour romantic romp, which belied a title that sighed that there was no time for love. But among other things, the girls in Sridhar's movie threatened to burst out of salwar kameezas glued to their Zaftig frames. This enslavement to voluptuousness was our parents' youth, not ours. Our fantasies were forged over visions of a sylph-like Amala in a pink sleeveless top, swaying to music from her Walkman, as the backlighting bestowed on her an entirely warranted urban goddess aura. And if there's another artifact of pop culture that hot-wired itself into the very being of the Tamil youth, the way Agni Natchatiram did, I'm not aware of it. Call it solipsism, call it tunnel vision, I call it the unvarnished truth. The sun that you saw in the opening credits of that film, scudding through clouds into a clear sky and blinding the screen with its brilliance, there was no better visual metaphor for the Mani Ratnam of the era. He was dazzling us with the trail he was blazing, and we were the first to see the light. Just as words bind themselves better to pristine parchment than to palimpsests, his images sank into our souls. The older generation, having watched a lot more cinema and having weathered a lot more trailblazing in the movies, was more guarded about welcoming Mani Ratnam, as if to embrace him would be to wallow in the shallow pools of youthful faddishness. It was a while before they realized that Mani Ratnam was no fad, that he was here to stay, and that he would go on, after Roja, to make the kind of movies that they wanted him to make, and that, in a sense, he'd become them. Hence my claim that no one knows or feels about Mani Ratnam the way we do. That scene in Agni Natchatiram where Harold Faltermeyer's theme for Beverly Hills Cop bounces off the walls as Amala and her girlfriends anticipate their first taste of nicotine with stolen cigarettes, that was us. That was the garish synth music that blared from our two-in-ones. That was the forbidden forest fascination that cigarettes held for us. Mani Ratnam didn't judge smoking, and if this made him irresponsible in the eyes of the grown-ups, it only made him cooler to us. Most filmmakers then were adults who left their youth far behind, and their portrayals of the young harked back to their times. Mani Ratnam, on the other hand, seemed to be one of us. Someone who, in front of his parents, would pore over cyclo-style sheets from brilliant tutorials over late-night cups of tea from a thermos. Only, hidden in those impenetrable thickets of IIT problems, would be a comic book or a much-thumbed copy of Debonair magazine. With his depiction of the youngsters in Agni Natchatiram and the films that followed, he seemed to completely get us. He seemed to get that school isn't all that it's cracked up to be when the younger sister in Mona Ragam wanted Revati to get married on a weekday so she could bunk classes. He seemed to get that virginity isn't all that it's cracked up to be when he unleashed a waggish scene in Agni Natchatiram with an unmarried Nirosha walking into Karthik's house and confessing in the presence of his comically horrified family to being pregnant. He seemed to get that respecting elders isn't all that it's cracked up to be when the little girl in Anjali, in the midst of a heated family argument on the building staircase, urges her father to shout back and silence the bald neighbor asking them to take their dirty laundry indoors. A mere translation does little justice to the level of disrespect in her choice of
Sample complete. Ready to continue?